481. Voldemort is dead. Snape is gone. Chapter 458. Lord Voldemort's demise. Snape's departure. Snape was unusually quiet that day. Ted had expected that at the end, when Lord Voldemort stood caught in the trap, Snape would be overwhelmed, explosive anger, a flood of grief, or some dramatic, finally unleashed vengeance. Instead, he was almost numb, an exhausted calm about him. Ted understood why. Snape had always blamed Voldemort for Lily's death, but deeper down the real culprit in his eyes had been himself. The reckless boy who had told half the prophecy, who had let the dark arts and Slytherin pride pull him away from the only person he loved. He had replayed the what-ifs 1,000 times. If he had held back, if he had chosen differently, if he had not been so proud, Lily might still be alive. That regret was old and raw, and it left him without tears now, only a brittle, expressionless acceptance. When Snape finally spoke, his words struck Voldemort where he hated to be struck. "There is no such thing as undying," he said simply. Voldemort's face twisted into fury. He had never fully trusted Snape, but he had always believed Snape was clever enough to play both sides and pick the stronger one. If Snape were weak, he'd remain hidden under Dumbledore as a professor. If he were strong, he would inevitably come back to Voldemort when the time was right and become a useful pawn. That calculating ability is why Voldemort valued people like him. To be betrayed now by Lucius and by Snape was an insult at the height of his power. Worse, Snape had become legendary. Voldemort had always seen something of himself in the man, but he never expected him to rise to equal stature so quickly, and then stand opposite him. Even as he raged, Voldemort's strategic mind kept working. He had used the Thousand Souls array on Dumbledore earlier and watched the others closely. He took stock of the paths they represented. Dumbledore, he realized, was a master of transfiguration, a manipulator of change. At the legendary level, he had become almost pure light of change, a being of transformation rather than flesh. Grindelwald relied on collective power, on the force garnered from followers, a blunt aggregation of might. Snape, Voldemort thought disdainfully, was rooted in potions, something he had always underrated. As for the young man who had drawn them into this net, Ted, Voldemort couldn't make sense of him. Ted didn't cast in conventional ways, and yet effects obeyed him like wishes. He seemed to alter reality itself. Ted had, in fact, been using the magic net to reshape reality, not by rote spells or mind power, but by directly controlling the rules inside the array formed by the 4 gathered legendaries and the 4 artifacts. The array needed only a pattern and intent to generate functions. Within it, Voldemort, powerful as a legendary rule master, could be confined. If the 4 of them pressed their advantage, they could seal him forever. Voldemort didn't go quietly. He taunted them, goading Snape about Lily, mocking the old wounds. Snape's face gave nothing away. He only said in a low, steady voice, "Let's begin. No more delays." Ted, Dumbledore, and Grindelwald moved as one. 3 wands lifted, 3 spells answered, and the green light from Voldemort's snake-headed staff was immediately suppressed. Under Ted's guidance, those 3 streams of legendary magic didn't simply collide, they began to unmake him. Voldemort watched his augmented body crumble into dust. When his limbs and torso dissipated, something unexpected happened. From the crown of the ruined body rose a solid, living soul, still robed, still whole, holding the fallen wand. He looked as alive as he had the day he first sought power. Not a pale, translucent ghost, but a dense, condensed soul, like a nascent yang god. A detached soul can travel and possess, but Ted's array held him fast. Magical barriers shaped from countless runes repelled his attempts to pass through. If there had been ordinary people inside, Voldemort might have tried to take them, but all 4 were legendaries. Possession here would destroy him, so he fought with what he had, casting a volley of killing curses. Ted dismissed them by waving his wand, letting the green blast dissolve into raw, unaligned magic inside the net. Voldemort scowled at Ted. "That trick again? This boy, how does he do it?" he snapped. "No time," Ted said. "Professors, together, trap him completely. Snape, finish this." They did. The 3 legendary streams wove into a triangular prism prison that trapped Voldemort's soul and then tightened, shrinking until he could no longer move. Snape lowered his wand and, with a small, cold smile, pulled unexpected ingredients from his sleeves. Odd minerals, bones, rare herbs, things that gleamed and reacted without fire, as if he'd made a cauldron out of thin air. They watched him brew silently for 5 minutes. Voldemort sneered. He did not believe a potion could end him. Then Snape smiled. It was startlingly warm. He pressed one hand to his chest. A red light seeped out, blood-like and heavy, and he drew forth a fist-sized pulsing mass. He trembled as if in agony. Ted realized, horrified and awed, what it was. Snape was extracting his own life force, the bloodline modification that had come from the ultimate potion he'd once consumed, the partial vampiric evolution that gave him powerful abilities without vampiric weaknesses. He bled out altered bloodline itself. But Snape did not stop there. With the other hand, he pressed his forehead and pulled out a brilliant blue thread of light, the raw source of his magic, the seed that made a wizard. "No, stop!" Voldemort screamed, understanding at last. Snape was using himself as material. The two lights, red and blue, were blended into a single translucent drop no larger than a fingernail. Snape's body shook. He looked like a man giving his life away. "It's up to you," he said to Ted, then smiled and collapsed. The array trembled. Voldemort, sensing the horror of what was happening, threw everything into one last struggle. Ted tightened the net, pushed Snape gently out of the array. Snape was no longer a legendary. He was no longer even a wizard. The little drop lifted and hovered, and then, as if pulled by inevitable fate, flew toward Voldemort. "No, get that away from me!" Voldemort howled, but the potion entered his soul through his forehead. He screamed. Dark green magic poured from his pores and orifices, dissipating into the array and being converted into raw, unaligned power. The soul contracted, crumpling. Within minutes it shrank into something grotesque and infantile, the size of a fist, and then disintegrated entirely into raw magic, which the array swallowed and released into nothing. Ted felt it in his bones. Voldemort was utterly destroyed. A system prompt chimed, dry and clinical in contrast to the scene. Talent, otherworld knowledge, triggered, discovered. Hogyoku Manufacturing notes, orange, an item the Soul Society's reapers fashioned from souls and thoughts, able to manifest the will of things around it and turn desire into miracle. Its name implies a power that breaks the barrier between godhood and the ungodly. Requires 14,567 experience points to exchange. In a flash, Ted's account updated. By January 1st, a new Otherworld knowledge entry unlocked. Ted casually exchanged the necessary experience and claimed the notes, an odd little prize he meant to study and maybe replicate in the magic world. A week later, with Voldemort gone, the immediate chaos settled. Most Death Eaters had been routed or killed in the aftermath. The remaining cleanup fell to them. Ted's relief was tempered by loss. Snape had become an ordinary man again. Ted tried to persuade him to rebuild, to use the bloodline modification technology, to reconstruct a magic source as one might give a muggle a spark of magic so he could at least be a normal wizard again. But Snape declined. There was a softness in him now that the boys who'd feared him had never seen. He smiled, almost gentle, and spoke quietly, a hint of weariness in his voice. "No need. I feel lighter." They all respected his choice. Snape apologized to Neville and Harry, saying they had been good students and he had been a poor professor. The farewells were muted and sad. Ron and Jerry found his smile unsettling. There was something irrevocable about it. Snape himself felt awkward more from simple physical changes. His clothes sat oddly on him now. He would learn to live with it. He took a sum of money from Ted, nodded once, and left the wizarding world. He went to Australia to live as a muggle in the life he had once scorned. By giving up the last of his blood and magic, he had finally relinquished his old regrets, his guilt, his pain. He felt ready to start over, perhaps as a chemistry teacher, perhaps as a farmer. He had let go. Ted's work, meanwhile, was only beginning. He looked up at the midnight sky. Beyond the familiar moon, 7 other luminous bodies hung there, each as large as the moon, some larger, glowing in colors from deep crimson to ethereal blue. 7 other worlds looked down on him, bright and impossible, waiting. The night Lord Voldemort was finally destroyed, something unprecedented happened in the heavens. 7 worlds converged at once. No one really knew why, but the effect on the mundane world was immediate and catastrophic. Governments staggered, supply chains collapsed, panic, looting, and violent clashes filled the streets. Local authorities found themselves paralyzed. The clerks and civil servants who operate a state had either fled or stopped listening. In places where towns normally enjoyed a lot of autonomy, the official pleas not to hoard or riot felt absurdly hollow. Order, for the moment, had broken down. The British magical world was no exception. Voldemort's death did not instantly clear away the mess he had left behind. Reinforcements of monstrous cannon fodder were still on the move. Tombs he had experimented on swarmed with undead. Rogue dark wizards slipped through the cracks, and many local wizards who had collaborated with the Death Eaters had to be dealt with. It took days of cleanup. The Ministry of Magic eventually returned to London and resumed work. It even sent personnel to the Muggle side to protect the Queen and help the Prime Minister with thorny issues. But chaos reigned. Diagon Alley and Nocturne Alley had not recovered. Some shopkeepers checked on their businesses and found them looted or barely standing. Others fled when a muffled roar rolled down from Gringotts and set every hair on end. The roar came from a dragon in the bank's vaults, a creature the Ministry now had to reckon with. They couldn't simply abandon Gringotts. The goblins' vaults held everyone's deposits, and they couldn't leave a dragon in central London. Worse, the dragon eventually flew to the coast and caught massive 10-meter-long sea creatures for a meal, creatures that clearly weren't native to Earth. Londoners who could run were fleeing, roads jammed for miles. Ted, a wizard who also ran a game that now connected to the real magical network, had temporarily wrapped that coastal region into the game, intending to release it later for players to conquer. But Annie, a fast-growing red dragon inside the game, refused to wait. She flew straight into the fight. A 2-hour duel erupted. Red dragon life breath against the giant dragon's magic. Annie didn't kill him. Smaug was too powerful, but she wounded and drove him off. Annie, naturally, demanded a reward, arguing that since she had driven off the evil dragon, she deserved part of the treasure. Ted kept quiet. He had never revealed that Annie was his dragon. February descended in turmoil. The celestial convergence left traces in those who could sense such things. Ding, talent, otherworld knowledge, triggered, discovered, enslaving deities, purple. Enslaving deities was a brutal, infamous manual written by Jindo the Godbreaker, an Atalai troll priest from Azeroth. Instead of serving the gods, Jindo stole their power, finding, worshipping, stealing, and enslaving nature spirits through massive blood sacrifices. Become a god by force. It required 8,372 experience points to exchange, an ominous, costly ritual. The convergence was stronger than any previous one, by an order of magnitude. The extra-worldly monsters were numerous and varied. Sea dragons from a monster hunter world clashed with sea kings from a pirate universe. Undead swarms met dinosaur herds. Monsters fought monsters. Human governments still tried to communicate with each other, but logistics had collapsed. Britain's navy was creaky from years of neglect. Planes were grounded, ships wouldn't sail. Cities became isolated islands. Strange creatures appeared daily, and everyday life frayed. In the United States, where states already prized autonomy, some moved toward outright independence, forming national guards and superpowered militias. Bunkers and underground shelters proliferated, and sometimes the monsters spawned inside those shelters. In Britain, Ted used the magic network to cordon off the worst affected zones by folding them into the game, an imperfect solution because the magic world had limits. You couldn't stuff everything into a virtual container forever. Still, the magical community had rallied in response to the crisis. Races and factions formed a coalition army to deal with monsters and restart production. Even so, new threats kept appearing. Grindelwald, who had managed Africa with an iron hand, sent a desperate message to an old friend and pupil. Africa's grasslands bred hordes of otherworld monsters, but Grindelwald's saints had kept them manageable, until 3 days earlier when an enormous semi-upright lizard appeared. 18 meters tall, 25 meters long, with massive claws able to rip buildings apart. As a legendary wizard, Grindelwald did not usually beg for help. He only called Ted once before to take down a Balrog. This time, he asked Ted to intervene. Ted identified the creature as a Tarrasque beast, a level 20 elite magical beast, an apparent legendary. It seemed to have only middling intelligence, but its survivability was terrifying. Ted struck with a super magic dynamic wave sword and carved a 2-meter wound down its back, only to watch it begin healing 5 seconds later. Grindelwald had been fighting it for a day and a night, even using costly measures to kill it. Every time, the beast came back. Fire, ice, acid, alkali, magic, brute force. Nothing worked. It had no obvious weakness and could shrug off punishment that would fell other monsters. Grindelwald suggested Ted take it into the game, but there was a problem. Beings of legendary status could not simply be deleted by the rules. If killed, they could revive. If trapped inside the game, they'd become an in-game menace that would leap the boundaries. Ted briefly thought of Snape. If he were around, his legendary potions knowledge might brew something to sleep the beast for years. Ultimately, Ted did not put the Tarrasque into the live game. Instead, he created a sealed dungeon instance. Grindelwald crafted a powerful seal, and Dumbledore modified rules to trap it. Ted's plan was simple and grim: starve the thing to death. While the Tarrasque devoured everything across the grasslands, another colossal reptile surfaced elsewhere. Japan, long familiar with supernatural phenomena like the night parade of 100 demons, suddenly faced something far worse: a 20 to 30 meter upright lizard that tore open the old idle nuclear plant at Fukushima and began devouring its core. Fighter jets bombed it, but the creature, Godzilla, had atomic breath and regenerative power. It even incinerated one of the great yokai generals. Luckily, Godzilla eventually returned to the sea. Otherwise, Japan might have been destroyed. South Korea initially seemed luckier. When the Americans withdrew, Seoul gained de facto autonomy. Monsters there tended to be fewer and less massive, mostly individual-level supernatural beings. The government conscripted wizards quietly and blocked news reports, hoping that ignorance would preserve normalcy. But an ideological infection spread. Otherworld knowledge, strange human-skin scrolls, bone scriptures, the Nirvana Sutra of an evil Buddha, a dark Bible, had already started circulating since the last convergence. Extremist cults spread fast, especially in South Korea, where some elites even believed. The government decided to gamble everything on a grand, horrific plan. They called it the Gate of Evolution. Officially, it was a sacred research project. In practice, it was a mass sacrificial experiment. A shipload of middle school students was offered as a test cohort, and a remote community became the pilot site for the South Korean completion plan. The process wasn't biotechnology in the conventional sense, so much as a curse sorcery. Anyone infected by the ritual who survived 15 days would evolve into a new, extremely powerful being. Those who failed would twist into desire fiends, monsters formed from their inner wants, who fed on humans. Predictably, before the experiment was contained, extremists released the curse widely. Evolution spread beyond controlled zones. Monsters formed according to their inner desires and roamed everywhere. South Korea, as a nation, collapsed. Militarized pockets lingered in strongholds, but survivors were few, and no one had credible reports of the promised new humans. In Central Asia and India, a figure called New Saint or Old Immortal Modi rose, declaring himself God and spreading a new faith. Some escaped cultists and stubborn small sects of traditional yoga and Brahmanic followers reported that Modi was an otherworld demon of great power, likely a high-ranking priest of some malign deity. Ted's magic web monitored it. The entity's level appeared around 20, a half-step legendary. Ding. Talent. Otherworld knowledge. Triggered. Discovered. Ultimate Lifeform Cultivation Manual. Purple. Ultimate Lifeform Cultivation Manual, purple, was the Monster Association's Psychosis Notes, a plan to create the ultimate lifeform, Orochi, through countless experiments and horrific sacrifices. The resulting creature reached dragon-level power, but remained monstrous. It required 6,342 experience points to exchange. Across continents, strange things multiplied. In South America, a humanoid monster with a proboscis stalked humans with high-tech cold weapons. Serpent people performed inscrutable sacrifices in pyramids. Packs of dinosaurs began streaming north toward North America. In Canada, plants mutated en masse, cracking concrete and emitting addictive, hallucinogenic gases that enslaved people. India was convulsing under Modi's war against local magical factions. Brahmins, Shaivites, yogis, strange sacred beasts appeared in the Ganges, and zoo reptiles mutated. Over months, global communications regressed centuries in effect. Most places were cut off. Ted used the chaos to his advantage. Expanding the magic web, he connected the official mundane forces and magic world powers in as many places as he could. Over several months, more remote states lost contact entirely. Some survivors consolidated power through the web's network. By then, the convergence's effects in the sky were obvious. The 7 celestial bodies that had appeared the year before grew larger and closer. It seemed only a matter of time before Earth would be fully linked to those worlds. Ted had, by that point, practically blanketed the globe with the magic web. He had exceeded the original purpose of the strange magic. The magic web weaver profession leveled to 7. It was time, he decided, to make a drastic choice. He called a grand meeting of all forces connected to the web and laid out a plan to wage one great, final war against the invading otherworld entities, and then use the web's power to separate the world into 2 domains, inside and outside. The inner world would be sealed by the web, an isolated reality in which memories of the magic world and the other horrors would be erased. It would be an illusory but safe life. No magic, no superpowers, no ghosts, no aliens. The outer world would remain connected to the unknown worlds, where people would continue to fight in reality and face whatever destiny awaited them. This was, in Ted's words, a battle for all humanity. The war started on January 3rd, 1999. Every unit hooked into the magic web assumed a profession. Gundam-like mechs and berserker warriors fought side by side with wizards and psychics. Poke-like creatures merged and super-evolved. For nearly a year, from January until December 12th, forces ground through monstrous threats, eliminating them one by one. At the end, Ted used 7 artifacts gathered during the campaign to enact the split. The treasures were the Deathly Hallows, a symbolic runic composite of Elder Wand, Resurrection Stone, and Invisibility Cloak, plus the Tear of Asha, the World Tree Root, a fragment of the Spark, a shard of the Cosmic Cube, a piece of the Kunlun Mirror, and the Kusanagi no Tsurugi. As the world cleaved, the 7 celestial bodies faded from daylight, and a clear dividing line appeared in the sky. Then the hardest choice arrived for every living soul: accept oblivion and live a peaceful life inside the web, memory of magic and horror erased, or stand in the outer world and keep the memory, keep the power, and face the unknown. Those who entered the inner world would have all memories of the magic world removed. A handful of warriors who had accelerated rapidly in power during the war could not safely have their memories fully erased without risking severe brain damage. They were allowed to keep fragments, under strict condition. To retain any memory, they had to sign a binding non-disclosure agreement, promising never to reveal the war to those in the inner world. And so the world split into 2 parallel lines. One, a gentle illusion of normalcy, the other, an unceasing battleground where humanity, armored by the magic web and the lessons of that terrible year, would continue to fight for survival against the 7 converging worlds. 483. Postscript. They held the wedding outdoors. The surface world still lay in ruins, waiting to be rebuilt, but the magical realm could provide everything they needed. Neville walked with Ginny, Ron held Penelope's hand, Ted walked beside Hermione, Jerry and Sherry clasped each other's hands, and Harry linked arms with Draco. 5 newlywed couples celebrated together. It was a festival to mark the end of the war and a farewell to the old world. The ceremony was joyful and full of people. Blessings came from every corner. Afterward, everyone rested for a time, a honeymoon of sorts, though many more tasks and battles would come later. Ted lingered in Diagon Alley while Hermione finished her errands. He strolled beneath crooked shop fronts, reached out, and pushed at a misaligned marble pillar until it slid back into place. "Ah," he said, pleased, "that looks much better." When Hermione was done, she wasn't hard to find. With the special permission she'd been given, she crossed the barrier between inner and outer worlds and stepped into a London that was quiet and whole. Here there had been no devastation. Those who had died in the war lived on, and history had unfolded as if the magical war had never touched this place. In the square, Ted sat on a low wall, playing a guitar. A small crowd had gathered as he sang, "Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, remember me to one who lives there. She once was a true love of mine. Tell her to make me a cambric shirt, parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, without any seam or needlework. Then she'll be a true love of mine." Hermione listened from the edge of the crowd. When the last note faded, she stepped forward and slipped her hand into his. They smiled at one another and walked away together. Around them, the listeners blinked, as if waking from a dream. "Where did the young man who was singing just now go?" someone asked. "I don't know," another answered. "He sang like a dream." End of the story.